I can't believe how everything spiraled that night. When I woke up the morning of my 40th birthday, the last thing I expected was to end the night in one of the craziest situations of my life. I've never been one to make a huge deal about birthdays, especially not the big 4-0. But, I figured I'd invite some close friends, have a few drinks, and just keep things casual. I live in a nice enough building with a rooftop terrace that's perfect for small gatherings. So, I decided to have a laid-back party at home. I invited a few people, some old friends, my parents, and my daughter, who just turned 18. It wasn't supposed to be a huge celebration, just enough to mark the occasion without too much fanfare. Then there was Jake, my neighbor. Jake and I have been neighbors for about 2 years now. He's 30, a few years younger than me, but we've always had this easy, friendly vibe between us. We've hung out a few times, mostly grabbing drinks or running into each other in the hallway. He's the kind of guy who's always been around, but I never thought much beyond that. I guess you could say I didn't realize there was anything between us until that night. But oh, there was. And I had no clue what was about to unfold. Jake showed up a little later than the rest of the guests. I was already on my second glass of wine when he arrived, and I remember feeling this weird flutter in my chest when I saw him. He looked good, better than I'd noticed before. He wasn't alone, either. He brought a couple of his friends with him, which I didn't mind at all. It was nice to have more people, and they seemed like cool guys. The party was in full swing by then. My parents were talking to some of my friends, my daughter was hanging out, and the vibe was really chill. Everyone was having a good time, and I was happy. For a while, anyway. I don't know when it happened exactly, but at some point in the night, I started feeling a little overwhelmed. You know when you've been hosting for too long and suddenly you just need a break? That's how I felt. So, I excused myself and headed up to the rooftop terrace. It's one of my favorite spots in the building. Quiet, with a great view of the city. Perfect for catching a breath. I didn't think anyone noticed me slip away, but apparently, I was wrong. I had been sitting up there for maybe 10 minutes, just enjoying the fresh air and looking out over the city, when I heard the door to the rooftop creak open behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured it was one of the guests just coming up for some fresh air. But then I turned around, and there was Jake, standing in the doorway, just kind of lingering there. He didn't say anything right away, and honestly, it threw me off a little. "Hey, Jess," he finally said, his voice softer than I was used to. "Hey," I replied, feeling a little awkward but trying to play it cool. "Needed a break from the party?" "Yeah, something like that," he said, smiling a little. But there was something in his eyes. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but it was different from the way he usually looked at me. He walked over and sat down beside me, and for a few minutes, we just sat there in silence. I could feel my heart starting to race, and I had no idea why. I mean, this was Jake, my neighbor. We'd hung out plenty of times before. But tonight felt different. "So," he said after a while, "how does it feel? Hitting the big 4-0. I laughed, trying to lighten the mood. "It feels like 30 but with more back pain." He chuckled at that, and for a second, things felt normal again. But then he looked at me, really looked at me, and that's when I realized something was happening. There was this intensity in his gaze, something I hadn't seen before. "I gotta be honest with you, Jess," he said, his voice low. "I've been wanting to talk to you all night, but I wasn't sure if I should." I frowned, feeling a little confused. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "I think I've been holding back for a while now. And tonight, I don't know, something just clicked." I stared at him, not sure how to respond. Was he hitting on me? My mind was racing, trying to process what was happening. "Jake, what are you talking about?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer me with words. Instead, he leaned in, slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. Before I knew what was happening, his lips were on mine, and the whole world seemed to fall away. I don't know how long we kissed for. Maybe a minute, maybe 10. Time felt like it stopped. All I knew was that it felt right, even though I hadn't seen it coming. Jake pulled me closer, and I could feel the warmth of his body against mine, the tension between us building with every passing second. And then, just as suddenly as it started, we pulled apart, both of us breathing heavily. My heart was racing, and I could barely think straight. "Jake," I whispered, still trying to catch my breath. "What just happened?" He smiled, that same intense look in his eyes. "I've liked you for a long time, Jess. I just never knew if you felt the same way." I didn't know what to say. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I hadn't planned on any of this. But now that it was happening, I couldn't deny that there was something there. Before I could respond, though, the door to the rooftop flew open again, and this time it wasn't Jake. It was Daniel, one of Jake's friends. He had clearly been looking for us, and the second he stepped out onto the rooftop, he froze. His eyes darted between me and Jake, and it didn't take a genius to figure out what had just happened. The tension in the air was palpable, and I could see the confusion on Daniel's face as he tried to make sense of the situation. Hey," Daniel said awkwardly, clearly unsure of what to say. "Everyone's been wondering where you two went." Jake and I exchanged a glance, both of us still a little shell-shocked by what had just happened. "We were just talking," I said quickly, trying to sound casual even though I knew Daniel wasn't buying it. "Right," Daniel said, looking between us again. "Well, I'm gonna head back downstairs. Just thought I'd let you know people are asking about you." He turned to leave, but not before giving me one last look, a look that made it clear he knew exactly what had just gone down between me and Jake. As soon as the door closed behind him, I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Jake chuckled beside me, shaking his head. "Well, that was awkward," he said. I couldn't help but laugh, even though I was still feeling a little freaked out. "Yeah, no kidding." We sat there for a few more minutes, neither of us really sure what to say. Part of me wanted to go back downstairs and pretend like nothing had happened. But another part of me, the part that had kissed Jake back, wanted to stay there with him and see where things went. "Maybe we should head back," I finally said, breaking the silence. "People are probably wondering where I am." Jake nodded, but I could see the hesitation in his eyes. "Yeah, you're probably right. But, Jess, this isn't over. You know that, right?" I swallowed hard, my heart racing again. "I know." The rest of the party was a blur. Jake and I managed to slip back downstairs without drawing too much attention to ourselves, but I could still feel the tension between us. Every time I looked his way, I could see the same intensity in his eyes, the same unspoken promise that this wasn't over. I tried to focus on my other guests, to mingle and enjoy the party, but my mind kept drifting back to that moment on the rooftop. The way Jake had kissed me, the way I had kissed him back, it was all I could think about. As the party wound down, people started to leave, offering their goodbyes and birthday wishes. My parents were the first to go, thanking me for a great night before heading home. My daughter was still hanging out with some friends in her room, so it was just me and the last few guests. Jake lingered in the living room with his friends, and every now and then, I caught his eye, my heart doing this weird flip each time. The tension was still there, buzzing just under the surface, and I wasn't sure what to do about it. After everyone else had left, Jake was still there. He helped me clean up a bit, stacking glasses and gathering empty bottles. The apartment felt strangely quiet now, the energy from earlier fading into something more intense. "I should probably head out too," Jake said after a while, though he didn't seem in any hurry to leave. "Yeah, it's getting late," I replied, my voice sounding smaller than I intended. I didn't want him to leave. Not really. But I wasn't sure how to ask him to stay without making things even more complicated. Jake stopped cleaning for a moment and looked at me. "Jess, can we talk? About earlier?" My stomach dropped. I knew this conversation was coming, but I wasn't sure I was ready for it. What had happened on the rooftop wasn't something we could just brush off, and I could tell from the look on his face that he wasn't planning to. "Yeah, we probably should," I said quietly, leaning against the kitchen counter as he came closer. Jake set down the bottle he'd been holding and turned to face me, his expression serious. I don't want to make things weird between us, but what happened up there? I wasn't expecting it, but I can't stop thinking about it. I let out a nervous laugh. You and me both. I don't know, Jake. It just happened. Did it mean anything to you? Because it sure as hell meant something to me, he said, his voice soft but firm. That was the question I had been avoiding all night. What did it mean? Did it change everything between us, or was it just a fluke, something fueled by the wine and the moment? I took a deep breath, trying to sort through my thoughts. I don't know what it meant, I admitted. I wasn't expecting any of this. I didn't think you felt that way about me. I've liked you for a long time, Jess, Jake said, his eyes locked on mine. I just didn't know if it was mutual. And I didn't want to mess up what we had. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Jake had always been the steady presence in my life, someone I could rely on, but I had never thought of him like that until tonight. And now, the idea that there had been something more between us all along was messing with my head. I didn't realize, I trailed off, not sure how to finish the sentence. He took a step closer, and suddenly the space between us felt charged again, like it had on the rooftop. I don't want to pressure you, he said. But I can't pretend like I don't feel this way anymore. My breath caught in my throat. There was something so raw and honest in his words, and it threw me off balance. Before I could respond, there was a loud crash from my daughter's room, followed by laughter. We both jumped, the moment shattered. God, I should go check on them, I muttered, pushing off the counter and heading down the hall. Anything to escape the intensity of the conversation for a minute. I knocked on my daughter's door, and she opened it a crack, giving me a sheepish grin. Sorry, Mom. We accidentally knocked over a lamp. Everything's fine. I sighed, relieved but still distracted. Okay, just be careful. And maybe wrap things up soon, it's getting late. Will do, she said before closing the door. I turned back to the living room, where Jake was standing, hands in his pockets, watching me. The interruption had given me a second to breathe, but now that we were back to just the two of us, I felt the tension creeping back in. Look, Jake, I said, walking back toward him, I don't know what this is between us. I didn't expect it, and I don't have any easy answers right now. I get that, he said, his voice soft. I'm not asking for answers tonight. I just needed you to know how I feel. We stood there for a moment, the silence heavy between us. I could feel the weight of everything that had happened, everything that might happen if we didn't figure this out. And honestly, I didn't know if I was ready for any of it. Maybe we should just take things slow, I suggested. See where this goes. Jake nodded, his expression softening. Yeah. I think that's a good idea. With that, the tension seemed to ease, and the air between us felt a little lighter. We had acknowledged it, whatever this was, and for now, that was enough. Jake smiled, that easy, familiar smile I had known for so long. Okay. I should head out, then. Let you get some rest. I walked him to the door, feeling a strange mix of relief and something else, something that felt suspiciously like anticipation. Before he left, he turned back to me, his eyes lingering on mine for a moment longer than necessary. Good night, Jess, he said softly. Good night, Jake, I replied, watching as he walked down the hall and out of sight. As soon as the door clicked shut, I let out a long breath, leaning against the doorframe. My head was spinning, my emotions all over the place. I didn't know what the future held for me and Jake, but I knew things had changed. Whether I was ready for it or not, something had shifted between us that couldn't be undone. I stayed up for a while after that, pacing around the apartment, trying to make sense of everything. My daughter and her friends eventually quieted down and went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the kiss, the way Jake had looked at me, the way I had felt when he touched me. It was like a door had been opened, and I wasn't sure if I could, or even wanted to, close it again. By the time I finally crawled into bed, I was exhausted but still restless. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts racing. What did this mean for me and Jake? Could we really just take things slow, like we'd said, or was I fooling myself? And what about Daniel? He had seen us on the rooftop, and while he hadn't said anything, I had a feeling he wouldn't keep quiet forever. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of dread settling in my stomach. I hadn't heard from Jake since he left, and I couldn't stop wondering what he was thinking. Did he regret what happened? Was he waiting for me to reach out? My mind was filled with 100 questions, none of which I had answers to. I got up, made some coffee, and tried to focus on anything other than the night before. But it wasn't easy. Every time my phone buzzed, I found myself hoping it was a message from Jake, and when it wasn't, I felt this weird mix of disappointment and relief. By midday, I still hadn't heard from him, and I was starting to feel a little crazy. Should I text him? Or was that too much? I didn't want to seem desperate, but I also didn't want to leave things hanging like this. I needed to know where we stood. Eventually, I caved and sent a casual message. Just a simple "Hey, hope you're doing okay. Last night was a lot. Let's talk soon?" I waited for what felt like forever, staring at my phone, willing it to buzz with his response. But nothing came. Not for hours. I went through the whole day with this tight knot of anxiety in my chest, wondering if I had made a huge mistake. It wasn't until late afternoon that my phone finally buzzed, and when I saw Jake's name on the screen, my heart skipped a beat. "Hey, Jess. Sorry for the delay. Yeah, last night was intense. I've been thinking about it all day. Let's definitely talk soon. How about dinner tomorrow night?" I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Dinner. That was good, right? It meant he wasn't regretting what had happened, at least not entirely. Maybe we really could figure this out. I quickly typed back, "Dinner sounds great. Let's do it." After sending the message, I couldn't help but smile to myself. Maybe things weren't as complicated as I'd feared. Maybe Jake and I could navigate this new territory without ruining our friendship. But, as it turned out, my relief was short-lived. Because just as I was starting to feel like things might actually work out, I got a message from someone else, Daniel. As soon as I saw Daniel's name pop up on my phone screen, my stomach dropped. My hands hovered over my phone for a second, unsure if I should even open the message. I wasn't ready for whatever he had to say, especially not after last night. But I couldn't avoid it forever, so I finally swiped the message open. "Daniel, hey Jess. We need to talk." I sat there for a few seconds, my mind racing. What did Daniel want to talk about? Was he going to confront me about what he saw last night? My head was spinning, and I couldn't decide how to respond, so I just stared at the message, hoping he'd magically change his mind and forget everything. Of course, that didn't happen. "Daniel, about last night. I didn't want to say anything in front of Jake, but we really need to talk. Call me when you can." There it was. He wasn't going to let it slide. He had seen me and Jake on the rooftop, and now he wanted answers. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead as I debated what to do next. After a few deep breaths, I figured it would be better to just get it over with. The longer I avoided this, the worse it would get, and I had a feeling Daniel wasn't the type to just let things go. So, I sent him a quick reply. "Me, okay. I can call you in a bit." I put my phone down, trying to calm myself. I wasn't sure what to expect from the conversation, but one thing was clear, Daniel wasn't happy. And honestly, I didn't blame him. He was Jake's friend, and whatever he saw last night probably made the situation look a lot worse than it actually was. The last thing I wanted was to cause drama between Jake and his friends, but I couldn't ignore this. After pacing around the apartment for a while, I finally worked up the nerve to call Daniel. He picked up after a couple of rings. "Hey," I said, my voice a little shaky. "You wanted to talk?" "Yeah," Daniel replied, his tone serious. "Look, I don't want to make this weird, but I saw what happened between you and Jake last night. And I gotta be honest, Jess, I'm not sure what to think." My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to figure out how to respond. "Daniel, it wasn't planned. I swear. Things just happened." "I get that," Daniel said, his voice softening a bit. But Jake's my friend. And I've seen the way he looks at you. I think he's been into you for a while now. I don't want to see him get hurt. I bit my lip, feeling the guilt settle deep in my chest. Daniel was right. Jake had feelings for me, and I had been too blind to see it until last night. But what was I supposed to do now? Was I leading Jake on, or was there really something between us? I don't want to hurt Jake either, I said quietly. But I'm still trying to figure out what all of this means. Last night was unexpected for both of us. There was a pause on the other end of the line before Daniel sighed. Okay. I just needed to hear you say that. I care about Jake, you know? And I don't want to see him get caught up in something that's going to end badly. I understand, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't want that either. After a few more minutes of awkward conversation, Daniel finally said goodbye, and I hung up, feeling more confused than ever. The conversation had brought up all the doubts I had been trying to ignore. Was I really ready for something with Jake? Or was I just caught up in the heat of the moment? I thought back to the way Jake had kissed me on the rooftop, the way it had felt so intense, so real. But then I remembered Daniel's words, the way Jake had apparently been into me for a long time. Was I ready to deal with that? To risk our friendship for something I wasn't even sure about? The rest of the day passed in a blur, and by the time the evening rolled around, I still hadn't made up my mind about what to do. Jake and I had plans for dinner the next night, and I knew I needed to figure out where I stood before then. But my mind was a mess, and I couldn't seem to get a handle on my emotions. I didn't sleep well that night. My thoughts kept racing, replaying the events of the party over and over again, and by the time the sun came up, I felt more exhausted than I had the day before. The next evening, I found myself standing in front of the mirror, getting ready for dinner with Jake. I had changed my outfit 3 times, trying to find something that felt casual but not too casual. I wasn't sure what kind of vibe I was going for, probably because I still didn't know how I felt about the whole situation. Jake texted me earlier, saying he'd pick me up at 7, and now it was 6:45. My heart was racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this dinner was going to be a turning point, one way or another. By the time Jake knocked on my door, I was a bundle of nerves. I opened it, and there he was, looking as handsome and easygoing as ever. He smiled at me, and for a moment, everything felt normal. But the tension between us was still there, just beneath the surface. "Hey," he said, leaning in to give me a quick hug. "You ready?" "Yeah, let's go," I replied, grabbing my jacket and following him out the door. We walked to a nearby restaurant, one of those cozy little spots that wasn't too fancy but still felt special. The conversation started off easy enough, talking about work, mutual friends, and other harmless topics. But as we sat down at the table, the weight of what had happened between us hung in the air, making everything feel a little heavier. After we ordered, there was a lull in the conversation, and I could feel the tension building again. Jake seemed to sense it too, because he cleared his throat and looked at me with that same serious expression he had the night before. "So," he began, his voice low, "about last night." I felt my heart skip a beat. Here it was, the conversation I had been dreading and anticipating all day. "Yeah," I said, my voice barely audible. "We should talk about that." Jake leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "Jess, I meant what I said. I've liked you for a while. I just never knew if you felt the same way." I looked down at my hands, fiddling with my napkin. "I didn't know you felt that way," I admitted. "And honestly, I'm still trying to figure out how I feel." "I get that," Jake said, his voice soft but steady. "I don't want to rush you into anything. But I need to know if there's a chance for us, or if I should back off now before things get too complicated." His words hung in the air, and I could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on me. Was I ready to dive into something with Jake? Or was this all moving too fast? I cared about him, but I wasn't sure if I was ready to risk our friendship and potentially complicate things with my daughter and our mutual friends for something that I wasn't even sure about. "I don't want to hurt you, Jake," I said finally, looking up at him. "But I don't know if I'm ready for something serious right now. Last night was a lot, and I'm still processing it." Jake's face fell slightly, but he nodded, taking in what I was saying. Okay, he said, his voice quieter now. I understand. I just needed to know where you stood. We sat in silence for a few moments, the air between us thick with unspoken emotions. I could tell Jake was disappointed, and part of me hated myself for it. But I couldn't lie to him, and I couldn't rush into something I wasn't sure about. The rest of the dinner was quieter, more subdued. We talked, but the easy banter we usually had was gone, replaced by this new, awkward dynamic. By the time we finished eating, I felt emotionally drained. Jake walked me back to my apartment, and when we reached my door, he stopped, turning to face me. Thanks for dinner, he said, his voice soft. Yeah, thank you, I replied, feeling that awkward tension return. There was a moment where it felt like he might kiss me again, but instead, he just gave me a small, sad smile and turned to leave. Good night, Jess, he said, walking away down the hall. Good night, Jake, I whispered, watching him go. I stood there for a while after he left, leaning against the door, trying to sort through the whirlwind of emotions swirling in my chest. I knew I had made the right decision, but that didn't make it any easier. Over the next few days, things between me and Jake settled into a weird limbo. We didn't completely avoid each other, but things were definitely different. The easy friendship we had once had was strained now, and every time I saw him, I couldn't help but feel guilty for not being ready for more. It wasn't just Jake, though. My own emotions were a mess. Part of me wanted to dive in, to see if there really was something there with Jake, but another part of me was scared. Scared of ruining our friendship, scared of getting hurt, scared of complicating everything. I talked to my best friend, Sarah, about it, hoping for some clarity. We met up for coffee a few days after the dinner with Jake, and I spilled everything about the party, the kiss, Daniel's warning, and the awkward dinner. Sarah listened carefully, nodding along as I talked, before finally chiming in. Jess, it sounds like you're overthinking this, she said, sipping her latte. You like Jake, right? I don't know, I sighed. I think so? But I don't want to jump into something just because it feels right in the moment. That's fair, Sarah agreed. But don't let fear hold you back either. If you're interested in Jake, it's okay to explore that. You don't have to have everything figured out right away. Her words stuck with me long after our coffee date ended. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was overthinking things, letting my fear of the unknown stop me from exploring something that could actually be really great. After my conversation with Sarah, I couldn't stop thinking about what she said. Maybe I was overcomplicating things. I mean, life was messy, right? Not everything needed to be perfectly planned out. Sometimes you just had to take a chance and see where things went. But still, I felt torn. I didn't want to hurt Jake, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to risk the comfortable friendship we built for something more uncertain. The days went by in a blur. Jake and I exchanged a few casual texts, but it wasn't the same. There was no easy back and forth like before. Everything felt a little more guarded. I hated the tension, and I could tell Jake felt it too. It wasn't just the kiss that had changed things, it was the fact that neither of us knew where we stood anymore. And then there was Daniel. I hadn't heard from him since our conversation, but the way he had warned me still played on repeat in my mind. A week after the party, Jake texted me, asking if I wanted to grab a drink and talk. My stomach flipped when I saw the message. I knew we couldn't avoid the conversation forever, and part of me was relieved that he was taking the lead on it. Jake, hey, you free tonight? Thought we could grab a drink and chat. Me, yeah, sounds good. Let's meet at the Oak. The Oak was this little bar not far from our building. It wasn't fancy, but it had a nice, relaxed vibe, perfect for serious conversations. I felt a knot of nerves tightening in my stomach as I got ready, not sure how the night would go. By the time I walked into the bar, Jake was already there, sitting at a table near the back, a beer in front of him. He smiled when he saw me, and for a second, I could almost pretend things were normal between us. Almost. Hey, he said, standing up to give me a quick hug as I sat down. Hey, I replied, smiling back but feeling the tension in the air. Thanks for inviting me out. Of course, he said, taking a sip of his beer. I figured we should probably talk about everything. I nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle over us. Yeah. I think we should. There was a moment of silence, and I could tell Jake was trying to find the right words. I decided to break the tension first. Look, Jake, I know I've been kind of distant lately, I started, playing with the edge of my napkin. I've just been confused. About everything. He nodded slowly, his eyes focused on me. I get it, Jess. And I don't want to make things weird between us. But I also don't want to pretend like nothing happened. That kiss, it meant something to me. And I guess I just need to know where your head's at. I sighed, feeling the pressure building. I hadn't even fully figured out where my head was at, let alone how to explain it to him. But I owed him honesty. That kiss surprised me, I admitted. I didn't see it coming, and at the time, it felt right. But I don't know if I'm ready for more than that, Jake. I care about you, I do. But I'm scared. I'm scared of ruining what we have, and I'm scared of getting hurt or hurting you. Jake listened, his expression softening. I understand, Jess. I really do. And I'm not trying to pressure you into anything. I just needed to know if there's even a chance here. Because if there is, I'm willing to take things slow. We don't have to rush into anything. His words made my heart ache. Here was this guy, this great guy, who was willing to be patient, willing to see where things went, and all I could feel was fear. I looked down at the table, my mind spinning. I don't want to lose you as a friend, I said quietly. And I don't want to mess things up between us. Jake reached across the table, gently placing his hand on mine. You won't lose me, Jess. No matter what happens, we'll figure it out. His words gave me a sense of relief, but they didn't take away the uncertainty I felt. I wanted to believe that everything could work out, but I still didn't know if I was ready to take that leap. We sat there in silence for a few minutes, just holding each other's gaze, the noise of the bar fading into the background. Finally, Jake gave me a small smile and pulled his hand back. Let's not overthink this, he said, his tone lighter now. Let's just see where things go. No pressure, no expectations. If something happens, great. If not, we'll still be friends. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Maybe he was right. Maybe we were both putting too much pressure on ourselves to define what this was, when we could just let it happen naturally. Okay, I agreed, smiling back at him. No pressure. We finished our drinks, and by the time we left the bar, the tension between us had eased. Jake walked me home, and when we reached my door, he paused for a moment, looking like he wanted to say something. But instead, he just gave me a warm smile and said goodnight. As I watched him walk away, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, confusion, and something that felt suspiciously like hope. Maybe we could figure this out after all. The next couple of weeks passed in a bit of a blur. Things between me and Jake felt better, lighter. We didn't rush into anything, and for the most part, it was like things were back to normal, almost. There was still this underlying tension, this knowledge that we were both waiting to see where things went, but it wasn't overwhelming. But then something happened that threw me for a loop, something I hadn't expected. I was at work one afternoon, wrapping up a few emails, when my phone buzzed. It was a message from Daniel. Daniel, hey, Jess. Are you free to talk later? I've been thinking about some things and wanted to catch up. I stared at the message, my heart sinking a little. I hadn't heard much from Daniel since that awkward conversation after the party, and part of me had been hoping he would just move on. But clearly, that wasn't happening. I texted him back, agreeing to meet up after work, and spent the rest of the day trying to focus on my tasks instead of worrying about what he wanted to talk about. By the time I met up with Daniel that evening at a coffee shop, I was already on edge. He smiled when he saw me, but there was something in his expression that told me this wasn't going to be an easy conversation. Hey, thanks for meeting me, Daniel said as we sat down with our drinks. No problem, I replied, trying to keep my voice casual. What's up? Daniel took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. Look, Jess, I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened since the party. And I need to be honest with you about something. I felt my stomach twist. This couldn't be good. I know what you're going to say, I said, bracing myself. It's about Jake, right? Daniel looked surprised, then nodded. Yeah, it is. But it's not just about him. What do you mean? He hesitated, then leaned forward, lowering his voice. Jess, I didn't want to say anything before because I didn't want to complicate things. But I've had feelings for you for a while now. His words hit me like a ton of bricks. I stared at him, my mind racing. This was the last thing I had expected to hear. Wait, what? I asked, my voice shaky. Daniel, I didn't know. I didn't expect you to, he said quickly. I never said anything because I didn't want to make things awkward. But after seeing you and Jake, I don't know, it just made me realize I couldn't keep quiet about it anymore. I was speechless. This was the same Daniel who had warned me about getting involved with Jake, the same guy who I thought was just looking out for his friend. And now he was telling me he had feelings for me? I don't know what to say, I admitted, feeling overwhelmed. Daniel, I never saw you that way. I thought we were just friends. I know, he said, his voice full of frustration. And I'm not trying to make things difficult for you, but I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. I had to tell you. I took a deep breath, trying to process everything. Daniel, I appreciate you being honest with me, but I'm still trying to figure things out with Jake. I don't want to hurt you, but I can't just ignore what's happening between me and him. Daniel's jaw tightened, and I could see the hurt in his eyes. I get it, Jess. I do. But I needed you to know how I feel. I nodded, not knowing what else to say. I hadn't expected this at all, and now everything felt even more complicated than before. After a few more minutes of awkward conversation, Daniel finally said goodbye, leaving me sitting at the coffee shop, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I had walked into this meeting thinking it would be a simple chat, and now I was leaving with the knowledge that Daniel, Jake's friend, had feelings for me too. It was a mess. A complete, confusing mess. That night, I barely slept. My mind was spinning with everything that had happened, Daniel's confession, my unresolved feelings for Jake, and the complicated web I now found myself tangled in. How had things gotten so messy so fast? One minute I was celebrating my birthday, and the next, I was caught between two friends, unsure of what to do or how to move forward. The next morning, I woke up groggy and exhausted. I had planned to take the day to clear my head, but that idea went out the window when I got a call from Jake. Hey, he said, his voice bright on the other end of the line. I was thinking we could grab lunch today. What do you think? I hesitated, guilt gnawing at me. I hadn't told Jake about Daniel's confession, and I wasn't sure if I should. The last thing I wanted to do was create drama between them, but I also knew I couldn't keep this from him forever. Lunch sounds good, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Great. I'll pick you up in an hour. After I hung up, I felt a knot of anxiety in my chest. How was I going to navigate this without everything blowing up in my face? I needed to be honest with Jake, but I had no idea how he'd react. Would he feel betrayed by Daniel? Would it change how he felt about me? By the time Jake showed up to pick me up, my nerves were shot. I forced a smile as I got into his car, but my mind was racing with everything that had happened over the last few days. You okay? Jake asked as we drove to the restaurant. Yeah, just tired, I lied, not ready to dive into the conversation yet. Lunch was nice enough, casual, easy, but I could feel the weight of what I needed to say hanging over me the whole time. Jake seemed oblivious, laughing and chatting like nothing was wrong, and part of me envied how simple everything seemed for him right now. Finally, as we were finishing our meal, I couldn't hold it in any longer. Jake, there's something I need to tell you, I said, my voice shaky. He frowned, concern flashing across his face. What is it? I took a deep breath, bracing myself. It's about Daniel. Jake's expression shifted immediately. The easygoing vibe that had been between us all lunch seemed to evaporate. He set his fork down slowly, his eyes narrowing just slightly as he looked at me. "What about Daniel?" he asked, his voice calm, but I could hear the edge in it. I felt a lump form in my throat. This was it. I couldn't dance around it any longer, even though I wished I could somehow avoid this conversation altogether. But I had promised myself I would be honest with Jake, and I knew keeping this from him would only make things worse in the long run. I took a deep breath. The other night, Daniel asked to meet up with me. We talked, and he told me that he's had feelings for me. For a while, apparently. Jake's face remained neutral for a moment, but I could see the tension building in his jaw. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair as he absorbed what I just told him. "He told you that?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. I nodded, feeling a mix of guilt and anxiety building in my chest. Yeah. I didn't expect it, honestly. I thought he just wanted to talk about what happened at the party, but it was more than that. For a few long seconds, Jake didn't say anything. He just sat there, staring off into space, clearly processing the information. I didn't know what to say. My stomach churned, and I braced myself for the worst. What if this blew up everything between us? Finally, Jake let out a deep sigh and looked back at me. I can't say I'm surprised. I've noticed the way he's looked at you before. I just didn't think he'd actually say something. I blinked, taken aback by how calmly he was reacting. You noticed?" Jake gave a small, humorless chuckle. "Yeah, I noticed. But I figured he knew you and I were close, and he wouldn't make a move. Guess I was wrong. I'm sorry, Jake." "I didn't know he felt that way," I said softly. "I never saw him like that." Jake nodded, but I could see the wheels turning in his mind. He was trying to stay cool, but I could tell he was frustrated. He wasn't the type to explode or get overly emotional, but the way he gripped his beer glass told me this was bothering him more than he was letting on. "Did he say what he wanted from you?" Jake asked, his voice steady but tense. "He didn't ask me for anything," I explained quickly. "He just said he needed to be honest with me. I told him that I'm still figuring things out with you. I didn't give him any hope, Jake. I swear." Jake let out another sigh, rubbing the back of his neck. "I believe you, Jess. I do. But this complicates things. Daniel's a good friend, and I don't want this turning into some kind of mess between us. I didn't think we'd be dealing with a love triangle." I winced at the phrase. Love triangle. That's exactly what this was starting to feel like, and it made everything that much messier. I never wanted to be in this situation, where I was stuck between two friends, both with feelings for me. I cared about Jake, but now Daniel's confession had thrown everything off balance. "What do we do?" I asked, feeling helpless. "I don't want to hurt either of you, and I don't want to cause problems between you and Daniel." Jake looked at me for a long moment, his expression softening. "I don't know, Jess. I don't want to make this harder on you either. But I think we need to be clear about what we're doing. You and me." My heart pounded in my chest. This was the moment I had been dreading, the moment where I had to decide. No more tiptoeing around my feelings. No more waiting for the right time. Jake deserved an answer, and so did I. "I've been scared, Jake," I admitted, my voice trembling slightly. "I didn't want to mess things up with you. I didn't want to rush into anything and regret it later. But I think I've been overthinking everything. I like you. I want to see where this goes." Jake's eyes softened, and he reached across the table to take my hand. "I've been waiting to hear you say that." I smiled, relief washing over me. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had made the right choice. Jake was patient, understanding, and honest with me. He wasn't pushing me to make decisions I wasn't ready for, and that meant everything. "So, where do we go from here?" I asked, squeezing his hand. Jake leaned in, his voice low and warm. "We take it one day at a time. No pressure, like we said. But I think we both know there's something real here. My heart fluttered at his words, and I felt a surge of hope. Maybe things didn't have to be so complicated after all. Maybe I had been building up all this drama in my head when really, all I needed to do was trust my instincts. As we finished our lunch and left the restaurant, I felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. Jake walked me back to my apartment, and when we reached the door, he paused, turning to face me. "So, I guess we're really doing this, huh?" he said with a playful grin. I laughed, feeling a rush of warmth spread through me. "Yeah, I guess we are." He stepped closer, and for a moment, the world seemed to slow down. I could feel the electricity between us, the anticipation that had been building for so long. And then, without another word, Jake leaned in and kissed me. This time, it wasn't rushed or uncertain. It was steady, deliberate, like we both knew exactly what we wanted. His lips were warm and soft, and I felt a sense of calm wash over me, like everything was finally falling into place. When we pulled apart, Jake rested his forehead against mine, smiling softly. "This feels right." "It does," I whispered, my heart racing. We stood there for a few more moments, wrapped up in each other, before Jake finally stepped back. "I should let you get some rest," he said, his voice light. "But let's do something soon. I want to keep this momentum going." I nodded, feeling a sense of excitement bubbling up inside me. "Definitely." Jake gave me one last smile before heading down the hall, and as I watched him go, I felt like I was on the verge of something new, something exciting. But as soon as I stepped back into my apartment, the reality of Daniel's confession came crashing back down on me. What was I going to do about Daniel? For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about Daniel. I was happy with the way things were moving forward with Jake, but I knew I couldn't just ignore Daniel's feelings. He had been brave enough to tell me how he felt, and now I owed him an honest conversation. I couldn't let things hang in limbo, especially knowing how close he and Jake were. It was a Saturday afternoon when I finally texted Daniel, asking if he could meet up. I knew I had to talk to him in person. I couldn't let this drag on any longer. "Hey, Daniel. Are you free to meet up today? We need to talk." It didn't take long for him to respond. "Daniel, yeah. Let's meet at the park." The park was a neutral place, somewhere we had hung out a few times before. It felt less intense than a coffee shop or a bar, and I hoped the open air would help ease the tension I knew was coming. When I arrived at the park, Daniel was already there, sitting on a bench near the fountain. He looked nervous, his leg bouncing slightly as he waited. When he saw me, he smiled, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes that made my heart ache. "Hey," I said, sitting down beside him. "Hey," he replied, his voice quiet. We sat in silence for a few moments, neither of us knowing exactly how to start. Finally, I took a deep breath and broke the ice. "Daniel, I've been thinking a lot about what you said the other day. And I want to be completely honest with you, because you deserve that." He looked at me, waiting for me to continue. "I care about you, Daniel. You've always been a good friend, and I value that. But I don't see you the way you see me. I'm sorry." The words felt heavy as they left my mouth, and I could see the pain flicker across his face. He nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "I kind of figured," he said, his voice strained but steady. I needed to hear it from you." "I didn't want to hurt you," I said, feeling a lump form in my throat. "But I've been honest with Jake about everything, and we're trying to see where things go." Daniel let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging slightly. "Yeah, I figured that too. You and Jake, you make sense. I can't say I'm happy about it, but I get it." I bit my lip, feeling guilty even though I knew I had done the right thing. Daniel had put me in an impossible situation, but at least now there were no more secrets between us. "I don't want this to ruin our friendship," I said quietly. "I know things might be weird for a while, but I hope we can move past it." Daniel was quiet for a few moments, his gaze fixed on the ground. Then he looked up at me, offering a sad but sincere smile. "I don't know if things will ever go back to the way they were, Jess. but I'll try. I nodded, understanding that this was the best I could hope for. Things had changed between us, and maybe they wouldn't ever be the same. But at least we had cleared the air. We sat there for a while longer, talking about lighter things, work, mutual friends, random stuff, until the tension between us eased a little. By the time we said goodbye, I felt a sense of closure, even though it wasn't exactly the happy ending I had hoped for. As I walked away from the park, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and hope for what lay ahead with Jake. Things were still complicated, but at least now I had made my choice. The next few weeks felt like a breath of fresh air. With Daniel's confession behind me and things with Jake moving forward, I finally felt like I could relax and enjoy whatever this was between us. Jake and I didn't rush into anything serious, but we spent more time together, grabbing dinner, going to movies, and just hanging out like we used to, only now there was this new layer of intimacy between us. One night, after we had spent the evening watching a movie at his place, Jake turned to me, his eyes warm and full of that same intensity one had seen on the rooftop weeks ago. "Jess," he said softly, "I know we said we'd take things slow, but I think we both know this is more than just casual." My heart skipped a beat. I nodded, feeling a rush of emotions. "I know," I whispered. He reached for my hand, holding it gently. "I want to be with you, Jess. For real. I don't want to hold back anymore." For a second, I was speechless. This was everything I had been avoiding, everything I had been scared of. But now, sitting here with Jake, I realized that I wasn't scared anymore. I wanted this too. I wanted him. "I want that too, Jake," I said, smiling through the wave of emotion that hit me. His smile widened, and in that moment, everything felt right. We had made it through the awkwardness, the confusion, and the uncertainty, and now we were here, together. Jake pulled me into his arms, and as I rested my head against his chest, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. This was where I was meant to be. And so, what had started as a simple birthday party had turned into something so much more, a journey of unexpected twists, complicated feelings, and, ultimately, a new beginning with Jake. Life was still messy, and I knew there would be challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be. As I looked up at Jake, I couldn't help but smile, knowing that whatever came next, we'd face it together.